magnetize your minis, flight stands, custom kits, and all the hobby supplies you'll need from themagnetbaron.com.
Hello and welcome to the YouTube channel for Craftworld Eldar.com. I'm Brent, and in this video I will be talking about the Codex FAQ that dropped yesterday and the Balance data slate that dropped today. Now, before I dive in, I will just quickly say to those of you who are panicking about the changes to indirect fire, I hear you. I address them at length in the second part of this video. Yes, it's quite a blow. One of our easiest to use powerful tools has just been significantly nerfed. Overall, I don't think this is a big problem. This is a deep and powerful codex. There are some ways to play around those nerfs, and there's plenty of other great stuff in there, even if we end up not using Night Spinners as much. So it's for those of you who just bought two or three Night Spinners, I get it. I understand. I've had that happen to me too. It's upsetting, but as far as the state of the game goes in general and where craft worlds are, it's going to be fine. We're fine. If you do just want to hear me talk about that, and you don't want to sit through the Codex FAQ, which is frankly them just closing a bunch of loopholes, I will link in the video description where I start talking about the data slates and indirect fire. But for now, let's start with a quick run through of the FAQ. I'm going to focus on the changes to Craftworld's units. I won't talk a whole lot about Harlequins. I will acknowledge one important change to Ynnari, and that's what we're going to start with. So it's a single page FAQ, and the first update, this is page 92, the Ynnari. All this does is make it possible for Ynnari to still make use of the faction bonus, Strands of Fate. Ynnari are now essentially a Craft Worlds faction that can pull units also from Harlequins and Drakari with some restrictions. And the way the rules were written before, if you did that, you lost access to Strands of Fate, which was just an error in the way the rules. It was obviously not intentional, and they've closed the loophole and made it clear that your Ynnari force can include Drakari and Harlequins units, and you can still use Strands of Fate. Now, the next one, Malicious Frenzy, that's a Harlequins thing. They closed the loophole. We're not going to talk about it. If you're a Harlequins player, you can go take a look. On page 120, a change to the rules for psychic disciplines makes it possible for your Corsair Psychers, remember those guys, to actually affect Asuryani characters the way that it was written before. Technically, it was pretty limited what you could do with those models, and now it's been opened up a bit. It works the way it was obviously meant to work. The next change is a change to Crusade Rule on page 131. Collective Denial, it's a Psychic Fortitude thing. It's been nerfed slightly. If your unit contains 7 or more models, you no longer add 3 to your Deny the Witch tests. I never used it, but that definitely seems a little bit over the top. So that's gone. Now the change I'm most excited about personally, and we all knew was coming, I think. On page 143, Strands of Fate has been changed so that it's no longer invalidated by the inclusion of Phoenix Lords. And I don't think anybody was taking seriously the possibility that GW intended for the inclusion of Phoenix Lords to make Strands of Fate no longer function. Technically, the way the rules were written, if you included any Phoenix Lords in your army, you couldn't use Strands of Fate anymore because they don't have a craft world. And in order for Strands of Fate to work, all of your Asuryani characters had to be from the same craft world. But it actually says on all the Phoenix Lord datasheets that they have Strands of Fate. So clearly this was not intended. I don't think any tournament organizer was maybe seriously enforcing this, or very few of them. And that's been clarified. So you no longer have to worry that the rules lawyer in your local game store will tell you that if you take Bahareth, you can't use Strands of Fate. Not a thing. The next change is a change to Harlequins. It closes the same loophole for Solitaires. Solitaires broke Luck of the Laughing God in the same way that Phoenix Lords broke Strands of Fate, and now that's fixed, and you can take a Solitaire, and it doesn't create problems. The next change is an interesting one. I didn't even notice this, but technically before, your Howling Banshees did not actually need to succeed on their charge to shut down your opponent's ability to declare Overwatch and set to defend. So if you attempted to charge with a unit of Banshees, even if you failed the charge and they didn't get there, you could then charge with something else and your opponent still couldn't set to defend. Again, obviously not what they were going for. They closed that loophole, and now the Banshee Mask ability only takes effect if you actually succeed on your charge. The next change on 150 is a change to Bahareth. I know a lot of us, we saw this, and for a moment, we were afraid to breathe. We were terrified that they would take away the Cloud Strider Consolidate ability, and they didn't. They didn't take it away. It now simply says that once per turn, Bahareth can do that thing where he flies away. So either you shoot at something and then you make the battle focus move where, like a normal Swooping Hawk unit, you teleport somewhere else on the board 9 inches from enemy models, or you can do this after you charge and in place of a consolidation move. So you get to fight and you get to fly away before your opponent hits you back. Technically before, I guess, some people had this notion that you could do it twice. So you could shoot something, fly somewhere else, charge something, fly somewhere else. I mean, it would be hard to succeed on the charge, but I guess you could use Strands of Fate. So that's out. You can't do it twice. I honestly hadn't noticed that you could, but that loophole is gone. Good. He's really good. I don't want to give them a reason to nerf him. I'm really enjoying using him. So I think that's completely reasonable. That's fine. The next one is a trivial alteration to the war gear for striking scorpions. The Scorpion Claw replaces the Exarch's Shuriken pistol. I guess it prevents you from having 2 Shuriken pistols. It's not a big deal thing. I didn't even notice that was there. The next one, the Warp Spider Flicker Jump ability. This is when, if your opponent declares a charge against the Warp Spiders, you have an option to move them 6 inches, presumably away from the charging unit, to try to create a situation where your opponent is likely to fail the charge. Now, the nerf here is that your opponent, if you do this, can declare a charge instead against another eligible unit. This modification is already in the game for AdMech. If you've played a lot against those AdMech horse dogs, they have this fallback ability, and it was totally overpowered because it was a way to prevent your opponent from charging anything. You put them in a situation where they have to declare against the horse dogs, and the horse dogs run away, and now you cannot even charge the unit right behind them, even if it's easily in charge range or whatever. And now you can't do that anymore. So it still protects the Warp Spiders just as effectively as it did before, but it doesn't create a situation where your opponent just gets stuck there if there's something else that they could charge. Again, there's a precedent for this. It had not actually occurred to me, because I'm accustomed to playing against AdMech with that modification. It had not occurred to me that we even could be tricky in that way. I don't think it's going to affect the plans of a lot of players, but it is an important modification for game balance. And the support weapon attack nerf. We all suspected that they were not actually meant to have 7 attacks. Nobody could quite work out why they had 7 attacks. They have 2 attacks, and they have a leadership value of 7. That's why it said 7 there. It's not clear also why they would have had leadership of 10. That's crazy. The Avatar has a leadership of 10. Not even Eldred has that. Harlequin troop units had the core keyword added. Obviously, they were supposed to have the core keyword, so no surprises there. It's not like that was preventing Harlequins from being good. I mean, they've had an 80% win rate at Adepticon, so, And then the last change is also to Harlequins. It's a slight modification to the Solitaire's Blitz ability. Once per battle in your movement phase, when this model makes a normal move, it can blitz. Great, that's fine. And then there's an FAQ, and the FAQ is useful. It's maybe slightly disappointing. I had already assumed that this was the case, but if you use a CP reroll or any sort of reroll on a dice roll where you have already used a Strands of Fate dice, so this comes up with charge rolls, right? So this actually happened in my last game. You bring something in from Deep Strike, you set your first charge die to a 6, and then you roll the second charge die, and if you fail and you want to use a reroll, you do in fact have to reroll both dice. You can't retain the Strands of Fate die. Again, I don't I don't really understand what the argument would be if rules is written for only rolling one of the dice. You could have done that back in 8th edition, the way the rules were written, but definitely not in 9th. But I do always appreciate when they clear this stuff up. I wish that they would FAQ more rules interactions that are highly complex, even if any reasonable person can really only arrive at one conclusion. It's just nice to not have to, you shouldn't have to have been through 2 years of law school to make sense of what the rule is supposed to be. So it's nice to have the FAQ. So on the whole, nothing really new there. We're just closing loopholes, both loopholes that are theoretically were beneficial to us, like the warp spider thing, and also that were deeply problematic, like the Phoenix Lord thing. It's just, I'll sleep better at night knowing that the Phoenix Lord issue has been resolved. That said, nothing really big, nothing really surprising. The balanced data slate does not include a section for Craftworlds. Craftworlds did not get directly nerfed. We got indirectly nerfed. I will say I feel gratified that there is no section for Craftworlds in the balanced data sheet, because I had predicted that we wouldn't see Craftworlds dominate tables the way Drukhari did when they first appeared, and that we had become a faction that could win GTs and was good, but was not going to run away with the meta or be a major problem. And there was only one pure Asuryani list in the top 8 at Adepticon, despite there being a lot of Asuryani lists at the event. And so I feel vindicated by this. Harlequins, as I have already mentioned, did run away with things a bit. So they took some relatively significant nerfs, but Craftworlds have remained mostly unmolested. However, a blanket rule to how indirect fire works in the game has, as I said earlier, nerfed some of our most powerful units. Here's how it works. A unit that is targeting a unit out of line of sight receives the following penalties. 1, -1 to its ballistic skill. This is important. Not -1 to the hit die, -1 to the ballistic skill. Yes. So this is deeply problematic because there's no getting around this. And it means it stacks with other penalties to hit. So this means that your Night Spinners now have a ballistic skill of 4 when they're targeting something out of line of sight. So you can't get around that with masterful shots or by using a crystal targeting matrix. Not going to work. And if you're targeting something which is, say, behind dense cover, that conveys another -1. And just to be crystal clear, the reasons that these can stack, because you might be saying, Brent, in 9th edition, they've limited modifiers to hit and wound rolls to +1 or -1. Well, there's no modifier initially to the roll. The modifier is to your ballistic skill. So you can go to 4 ballistic skill and then be at -1, so hitting on 5s. And there are lots of factions that have abilities that just, we have one too with the Latok, where there's kind of a way to just do this. The crystal targeting matrix will get around that, but you're stuck at a ballistic skill of 4, that's a blow. And it doesn't stop there, kids. Also, any unit being thus targeted gets +1 to its armor save. This results in something curious, which is that the Night Spinner with the -2 AP, really, if it's targeting something out of line of sight, it really has -1 AP. And then if it's targeting something, say, behind a ruin, where that thing gets a cover bonus, it's then at -0 AP. And that's going to be most things. Most line of sight blocking terrain on the table these days tends to confer a cover bonus that advantages the AP. And so if your opponent, and AP bonuses and penalties are not capped, sometimes people misunderstand this, are not capped in the way hits and wounds are. So that means that the vast majority of the stuff that your Night Spinner would target out of line of sight, you'll hit it on 4s and you'll have no AP against it. And that's rough, but it doesn't stop there. It gets worse. It gets worse because power armor units have also gotten a bonus. Now, and I think this is necessary. I think that Marines are the beginning of the edition, Marines were terrifying, and now Marines are simply too fragile. As every army has gotten better and better and better at killing, Marines are back to just not being durable enough. So everything that uses power armor now can ignore -1 AP and reduce all other AP by 1. So it's actually better than the Eandon bonus, which if you come up against something that's at -3, right, your Eandon bonus stops kicking in at all and the whole -3 goes through. Not so. Power armor reduces all incoming AP by 1. So this means that if you had a unit of Space Marines behind a ruin, they would save on a 2+. And even if you had some way of increasing, they would save on a 2+ regardless. So, and that's also true of Sisters of Battle. That's true of anything that's using power armor. And so it's not a direct triple nerf to the Night Spinner, but it's a triple nerf, and that's pretty hard hitting. So just to recap, indirect fire, you're now -1 to your ballistic skill. Your opponent gets +1 to their, or -1 to your AP. So they get basically +1 to their armor save against anything that has AP, and, or even if it doesn't have AP, they just get +1 to their armor save. And because they're inevitably behind, in almost all cases, unless it's a hill, they're inevitably behind some kind of cover that bestows additional benefits to them. They will either also be -1 to hit, making you hit on a 5+, or they'll have yet another +1 to their armor save, which is going to make it really, really hard for our indirect fire weapons to pick up units out of line of sight. Okay, I'll give you a moment to gnash your teeth and tear your hair before I talk about ways to play around this. Okay, good. One way to play around this is to not lean into indirect fire units and instead think about how other units in the codex can perform a similar function by leaning into mobility. So if you think about it, a Night Spinner is going to put out an average of 7 shots at strength 7, -2 AP. And frankly, we already were in a situation before where when you targeted a unit out of line of sight, usually you were really only at -1 AP because they're typically behind a ruin, which improves their armor save by 1 unless it's a vehicle, which can't make use of cover in that way. So it was already the case that our -2 was really a -1. But this means if you have shuriken cannons on, say, windrunners, one option is to make the 22-inch move with a unit of Wind Riders. If you're using the Swift and Deadly Custom Craftworld trait, which means that you can still shoot even though the shuriken cannon is a heavy weapon now, in such a list, your Wind Riders could make a 22-inch move because when they ride the wind, they get an automatic +6 and then target something. And even 3 Wind Riders would put out 9 strength 6 -1 flat 2 damage shots, and your 6s to hit would be at -3 AP. Now, you're firing an average of 2 more shots than the Night Spinner, and you don't have to rely on potentially fickle dice, and they're coming in at significantly fewer points. You could potentially run 3 units of these things for less than what it would have cost you to run 2 Night Spinners and have them pick up hard to reach targets. Now, if you're not running Swift and Deadly, then you've only got a 16-inch move, but you can still do this, and it's still really good. You could also do the same thing with Viper jet bikes. Vipers are just really good for the points, and I honestly think that this blow to our indirect fire makes both Wind Riders and Vipers even better because they are now, proportional to what else is in the codex, even a more effective way of getting to those hard-to-reach units. And there are other ways to get to hard-to-reach units too, right? I mean, the Falcon drop pod move. There are ways to kill the things that your Night Spinners were killing without taking Night Spinners that are not that cumbersome to try to work into a list, and really not all that much less efficient. Yes, it's going to be harder to keep your Wind Riders safe, but if you're making if you're making an attack with 3 Wind Riders that are not using Swift and Deadly, that are making the, the 16-inch move, you can still battle focus them out of line of sight. You can't stay as far from the enemy as you could with a Night Spinner, but in a lot of matchups, it's going to be good enough. And if you really, if the battle focus move is in question, you can use Matchless Agility or Fire and Fade. Vipers don't have access to battle focus, so they would have to use Fire and Fade. But a unit of 3 Vipers is no joke in terms of its fire output. And you can get 3 Vipers for, if they're just taking that Shuriken Cannon, for around the cost of a Night Spinner, and you'll have 9 Strength 6 flat 2 damage Shuriken shots plus another 12 Shuriken Catapult shots, and then you Fire and Fade. Yeah, it eats up CP. Is it as good as supercharged Night Spinners? No, but it's really solid, and it really isn't clear that it's some sort of devastating trade-off. Now, your other option is to power through with our indirect fire units by finding ways to play around these penalties. One is to run Ulthway and make use of Discipline of the Black Guardians. Now, you may remember that Discipline of the Black Guardians is a 1-point Ulthway stratagem that allows a unit with the Guardian keyword to get +1 to hit. Now, it used to be the case that you could make your support platforms, which have the Guardian keyword, hit on 2s. Now, we're looking at hitting on 3s with those. There's also a stratagem that anybody can use that allows them to reroll 1s. I am of the opinion that rerolling 1s, now that we're hitting on 4s, rerolling 1s really just isn't good enough. But if you can go back to hitting on 3s and you have the option for an additional CP to also reroll 1s, that's pretty good. So I think in an Ulthway list, having at least 1 unit of support platforms can make sense. There's still the AP problem, and for that reason, I suspect to lean into the D cannons. I haven't seen a ton of triple D cannon units appearing in some of the initial top lists, but I've got to say, it's a solid unit. It helps you control the midfield. It has really good synergy with a lot of the other stuff in the book, and with -4 AP on the D cannons, it isn't that big a problem if your opponent gets a bonus to their AP, and if you can make those things hit on 3s and reroll 1s, well, that's pretty good. I think that as an indirect fire option, those larger units of D cannons, and one of them is also rerolling a wound roll in an Ulthway list, still absolutely makes sense to include. You might also consider doing the same thing with 3 Shadow Weavers. I do think essentially the total lack of AP, because that's really where you end up with the Shadow Weaver. Again, because they get +1 to their AP if it's out of line of sight, which negates one of your -2, and then if they're behind a ruin, there goes your other one. Or if they're Space Marines. So Shadow Weavers, I'm not totally sold even in an Ulthway list on that build. I don't think it's bad. The other thing you could do is to take Night Spinners, give them vectored engines, which allows each of them to make a battle focus move, and pull the Fire Prism trick where a lot of the time your Night Spinners are targeting something that if they just poke the forward bit of their hull out, they can quote unquote see, because we trace line of sight from the hull. You don't necessarily always with your Night Spinners need to target something that is completely out of line of sight, even if you move out into the middle of the board, right? So there's a way to use the Night Spinner to target a thing that is to create line of sight by moving the tank, and then burn out your vectored engine to give it a battle focus move to pull it back behind a piece of terrain, so you still finish your turn out of line of sight, does some damage. Yes, sometimes are you going to want to target something that you can't draw a beat on in that way? Sure. And question number 2, Brent, if I'm doing that, does it not make sense to just take a Fire Prism? Yeah, really good argument, or 2 Fire Prisms. Fire Prisms are more expensive, so there is that to consider, but they do hit a heck of a lot harder. They don't have the option to target something it really is just completely untouchable otherwise, which your Night Spinner could do, albeit at a relatively significant penalty. It is something to at least think about if you did just buy 2 Night Spinners and you're desperate to use them and you don't have a cabinet full of multiples of every unit in the codex. I think that this is a solid way to still get some play out of them. The other way to still get some play out of them is to remember the Resonator Shard stratagem, not the other thing. So Resonator Shard is a 1-point stratagem that allows a unit that is either a D-Cannon, a Shadow Weaver, or a Doom Weaver to reroll all of the hit rolls if the unit it's targeting is within 12 inches of one of our Ranger units. Now, it has to be the Foot Rangers. Sadly, they did not give Resonator Shard to Shroud Runners. Bummer. But I've been running 3-up Rangers in the majority of my lists, and I bet many of you are too. And there is an opportunity to start the Rangers in the midfield out of line of sight, and then when you really need to pop something, you move them up. So what you could do is run a couple of Night Spinners, give them the Vectored Engine to pop out and shoot something, or don't give them the Vectored Engine and use Fire and Fade, have them pop out and shoot something to avoid taking the -1 to hit and giving +1 AP to your opponent, still finishing your turn completely out of line of sight of the enemy. And then when you really need to target something that's hard to reach, you move your unit of scouts within 12, you light it up that way. And then if you would have been hitting on 3s before, but now you're hitting on 4s, but you're rerolling all of your misses, you're actually hitting a little bit more than you would have. We still run into the AP problem, but it is a way to mitigate that a little bit, and without having to allocate any new resources, because you probably have Rangers in your list anyway, and Resonator Shard is just hanging out there as a stratagem that you theoretically could use. So that's what I've got for ways to play around this. I think that one option is to lean into units that can find other ways to draw a line of sight on difficult to reach enemy targets, either because they're very, very fast or they're coming in out of deep strike. And then your other option is to try to power through with those indirect fire units, particularly the platforms in an Ulthway list. That said, there's no way around the fact that this is a nerf. I am by no means suggesting that, oh, it's just like before if you do these things. I'm not. Stop being mad at me. I get it. If you're mad, I understand why you're mad. I think that if I didn't have a bunch of other units in my collection to fall back on, I would probably also be mad. I will say that there is another aspect of this that we have not talked about, which is the way in which it also benefits Craftworld, and that is that we too gain those same benefits against indirect fire. Elves do not stand up well to indirect fire. It's one of the reasons why up until now, and with the new Dark Reapers, I've thought Dark Reapers are simply not viable. If you can't fire and fade back into a vehicle, they're just going to get killed. But if you have them behind a ruin, they effectively have a 1-up save against indirect fire, and they're going to be your opponent gets -1 to their ballistic skill, and you could use the lightning fast to give them an additional -1. So your Dark Reapers, in theory, will be saving on 1-up and hittable on 5-up. Is that a reason to use Dark Reapers? Do they have other problems? They do. They have other problems, but it certainly makes them a bit more viable, and that's going to be true of all of our infantry. One of my issues with foot conclaves of warlocks has been that they're just too vulnerable to indirect fire, and frankly, I've been a little bit uncomfortable with Shining Spears and Wind Riders for the same reason. There's a lot of flat to indirect fire in the game, and if your opponent can just pick up your bikes with that, those units are a little expensive to have on the board now that Shining Spears no longer have their crazy and vuln against shooting, and Wind Riders went to a 3+ save, but before it was a little bit touch and go. But now your Wind Riders have a 2-up save, and if they're behind a ruin, they go to 1-up. I think a lot of units that we were struggling to use before effectively in certain matchups suddenly have a lot more play. To put it another way, Tau are not nearly as scary as they were 5 minutes ago. The biggest problem playing against Tau as an Eldar player is that they had lots of really potent indirect fire, and now they kind of don't. Also, the Tau broadside battle suits lost the core keyword, which means they can't be buffed in all kinds of ways. The Tau have been reined in, which is really good for us because that was going to be one of the hardest matchups for Craftworlds going forward. Another really difficult matchup for Craftworlds, frankly, was Harlequins, and this data slate has significantly nerfed Harlequins, partially because Void Weavers went from, I think, 90 points to 130 points. You can still take up to 3 in a squad. I thought they were going to go to 2. But that's a like 48% increase in point cost. Star Weavers also got more expensive, not quite proportionally as much, but they're at 95 points now. These are pretty significant nerfs to a faction that had an 80% win rate at Adepticon. And that too helps Craftworlds. The last change that both disadvantages us in a way, but also advantages us in others, is that the Bodyguard ability has been changed. So you may remember that the way Bodyguard worked before, you could not target an HQ unit until all of its bodyguards were killed. So even snipers, right, that ignore Lookout Sir, couldn't target an HQ unit. And now what Bodyguard does is much reduced. In order to benefit from Lookout Sir, normally there have to be at least 3 models left in the squad that's protecting your HQ. And if a squad has Bodyguard, then that's not the case. If there's even just 1 remaining, they will throw themselves heroically in front of the thing. But snipers can still target characters. The way this affects us is if you are running a unit of Footlocks and making them a Seer Council to bodyguard one of your Farseers, well, now they bodyguard in that new way where they provide Lookout Sir even when there's a single Warlock, but snipers can still shoot them. Our snipers can target things that are bodyguarded. I think this is probably overall going to be a benefit from us because there were some other factions that had some really powerful bodyguard combos. We had a decent one, but I don't think anybody absolutely needed it. So there it is. That's the FAQ and the balance sheet. Craftworlds have certainly been affected, but not nearly as much as the factions that were really dominating the meta. I did not talk about the changes to Custodes, but they've been reined in a big way too. Their defensive stats, their defensive stratagems, excuse me, have been limited to once per game. That's massive. So Harlequins and Custodes are going to be much easier to play against. Tau are going to be much easier to play against. And yes, our indirect fire has been nerfed, but to be perfectly honest, and I say this knowing that there are going to be some people in the comments probably who are really mad, but I think it's good for the game. I do. I don't like that indirect fire is basically impossible to counter in the vast majority of lists, and so I think it's I think it is better for the game if it is not just this like uncounterable superpower that some factions have in place of other stuff. I think in the long run it will make for more interesting games. I certainly will find it more interesting to try to think up ways to reach my opponent's well-protected units with jet bikes and with drop pods and with feints, rather than just declaring that regardless of what my opponent does, I am lighting them up on turn 1. That seems more fun. And let me be clear too. It's not like this doesn't affect me. I know I'm being cheerful about this, but the most successful up-and-coming list that I had going for competitive play was all about locking my opponent up on turn 1 and 2 in their deployment zone while just overwhelming them with ridiculous amounts of indirect fire. It was going incredibly well. This list is completely unviable now, and up until now I had not lost a game. So again, I'm feeling it too. I really am. But I think we're going to be fine. I think it's a deep codex, and I do think the game is going to be better for it overall. So that's what I've got. I will be back soon. I've been working on an update to our best units and how to use them. There are a couple of units that are now coming off that list. I know many of you are waiting for that content. I've gotten a lot of emails about it. I need to update it both on the website and there will be a video. And then I have a whole bunch of other stuff queued, some of which is going to drop pretty fast after that. I am very excited to do a unit-focused video for the Farseer. My goodness, are there a lot of really good ways to play the Farseer. That's coming, and also some other stuff that will be a fun surprise. So I'll be back soon with more content. A special thanks to my Patreons who enjoyed early access to this video. And if anybody else is interested in becoming a Patreon, I will link my Patreon in the video description. If you liked this video, I hope you will click like. If you want to support the channel, even though this video made you a little bit mad when I didn't go super negative on the nerfs, please still consider liking the video so that more content comes in the future. If you haven't subscribed, please consider subscribing. And if you have your own thoughts on what these changes mean for Craftworld Eldar, even if they're a bit gloomy, feel free to leave them in the comments below. That's it, guys. Best of luck in your next campaign. Back with more soon. Take care.